This Booknotes Plus podcast is a repeat of a Q&A program from November 4, 2015. The featured guest, Ronald Feinman, is the author of the book Assassinations, Threats, and the American Presidency, in which he examines attempts on the lives of presidents and presidential candidates throughout history.
As more people cancel cable TV, C-SPAN's funding is at risk. This summer, an anonymous donor has stepped up to help by matching all donations up to $25,000. I'm Caitlin with C-SPAN, and this means your gift will go twice as far. Your donation supports unfiltered access to government and public affairs programming, including the C-SPAN podcasts you value. Visit cspan.org/donate to make your gift today. Every dollar helps us reach our $25,000 goal. Thank you for listening and supporting C-SPAN. Donate today at cspan.org/donate.
Ronald L. Feinman, you have a book called Assassinations, Threats, and the American Presidency. Why did you get interested in this?
I would say it all began when I was in college and was taking an English freshman course and had to write a term paper, and I chose the Lincoln assassination as my topic. I was fascinated by it. And then the following year, the Kennedy assassination took place, and of course that obviously kept everyone's interest and has continued. And ever since, I've been interested in it, and I have done interviews, as far as various groups and lectures. And 2 years ago, Roman Littlefield wrote to me an email at Florida Atlantic University, where I still teach, and asked me, we see you do lectures on the subject. Would you like to write a book? And here I am, semi-retired, or sort of like retired. I have a lot less, work to do, more time, and I figured, why not? So I said, okay. So they sought me out, and I was pleased to say yes.
You start with Andrew Jackson. What's that story?
Well, Andrew Jackson is the first president that we know of that had any problems with, with assassination threats, and there were three such cases. There was the case of a young man who punched him in the nose in 1833, which is pretty minor, but it's the first example of assault. Then we have Junius Brutus Booth, the father of later Lincoln assassin John Wilkes Booth, who writes a threatening letter to Jackson in 1835, and his handwriting has been authenticated by the Tennessee History Project that it is definitely Junius Brutus Booth, himself a well-known actor, and this is 3 years before John Wilkes Booth is born. So it makes you wonder if it's genetic or just a coincidence that the father and the son both had the same thought in their mind, although John Wilkes Booth followed through, and of course Junius Brutus Booth just wrote a threatening letter.
There, as you know, there were a lot of duels back in those days, and Andrew Jackson had been involved in one. How many times had he been in a? Do you have any idea? I mean, in some kind of a gun battle?
I think about 6 times, I believe it was, that he was involved in a gun battle. Jackson. He was a very meteoric figure, a person who made people furious. His time in office was the most contentious it had been since the founding of the Republic. And I think that's what may be caused in his second term with his stand on the National Bank and his earlier stand on the nullification crisis, that we would have the situation of people threatening his life. And in this case, it was only, on paper. But then there's Richard Lawrence in 1835, who actually came to the U.S. Capitol after a funeral for a congressman. Jackson was there, and actually went ahead and had 2 pistols on him. And he assaulted Jackson, fired 1 pistol, misfired, unbelievable, fired the second pistol, misfired, and then Jackson, who had his walking cane, assaulted him and stepped on him and kicked him down until others came along. He actually helped to subdue his own potential assassin.
Summarize, as you do in the introduction, the amount of assassination attempts and threats there have been over the years.
Well, there's been 16 presidents who have faced assassination threats, although none directly eyeball to eyeball since Ronald Reagan, but 16 presidents. I also cover 3 presidential candidates. I talk about Huey Long, who in 1935 was assassinated. And I talk about Robert Kennedy in 1968, who was assassinated, and George Wallace, who was shot and paralyzed for life in 1972. So I cover candidates as well as presidents. And it's a long list, as you can see, 16 plus 3. And also could have included Andrew Johnson, who was supposed to be assassinated when Lincoln was, but the person who was supposed to do it chickened out. And as a result, Johnson was not harmed. So you could actually add him to the list, at least in theory.
Can you sum up what kind of person does it?
Well, definitely mental illness is the key factor. I would not say it's true with John Wilkes Booth, for instance. I think it was purely politics about the Civil War. He was a Confederate sympathizer who was furious at the war ending. So that's, I think, not mental illness. But most of them have mental illness. And some of them also join mental illness with the issue of political differences, like Booth, but Booth, again, only that. And some have economic issues, struggling to survive in a difficult world. Some have religious as well. I would say Sirhan was partly that with Robert Kennedy. But I think mental illness is the one that really draws people together, except for a case like John Wilkes Booth.
James Garfield.
James Garfield. I would argue that James Garfield is probably the biggest loss. And, one might say, how can you say that when we have Lincoln and Kennedy, John F. Kennedy? Well, Lincoln had made quite a record for himself. Of course, it was a loss when he was killed. John F. Kennedy had accomplished quite a bit in a little more than 1,000 days. But Garfield, who was a brilliant man, very intellectual, very talented, only had 4 months before he was shot and mortally wounded, and suffered for 79 days with medical malpractice, I guess I would call it. They didn't know what to do. Medicine was not very advanced in 1881. I've often said when I speak on this that 100 years later, Ronald Reagan was saved in 1981 because of the times. If it had been 1881, he would have been gone. So I think Garfield could have been, and is believed by many experts to have been, could have been, the best president since Lincoln until Teddy Roosevelt. But of course, he only lasted 2.5 months after 4 months. So he had the second shortest term in the presidency after William Henry Harrison, who died of pneumonia after 1 month in 1841.
You say, of course, that he was killed, or he was shot here in town.
Yes.
By a man named Charles Guiteau.
Yes.
Who was he, and what happened to him after all this?
Charles Guiteau was a man who was definitely a lunatic. He was a very unstable person. But the story about him is interesting because he claims he made campaign speeches for Garfield in 1880, which he might have before some audiences. He liked to get up and be on a soapbox, as we say. And when Garfield won, he felt, Guiteau, in his crazy mind, that what he should get is an ambassadorship to either Austria-Hungary or France, even though he was not someone of any renown. And he actually went to the White House a few times and met with President Garfield and Secretary of State James G. Blaine, and came in with information, and they, I guess you would say, humored him. They spoke to him, were nice to him. He left some information, and they said, we'll be back to you. But they did nothing about it because he was not qualified for the kind of positions he was applying for. But the fact is, what gets me the most about this is there was no Secret Service protection yet. The Secret Service had been created in 1865 to deal with counterfeit currency, but not otherwise. And in fact, it was on Lincoln's desk to be signed when he was killed, but it was signed by Andrew Johnson to create the Secret Service for counterfeit currency. But the point is, it wasn't until William McKinley in 1901 was assassinated, 3 in 36 years, Lincoln 1865, Garfield 1881, and William McKinley in 1901, that finally the Secret Service became the agency that would be responsible for the president. But back in 1881, the story goes, there were 2 White House police officers, at the White House. So you say, oh, so they would check on if Guiteau came in to see Garfield. No, they were not there to check people going into the building. They were there to keep people off the lawn. Imagine that? Crazy.
What happened to Guiteau?
Guiteau ended up going on trial. He acted very crazy in his trial. He did dancing and singing in falsetto voice. He put on a performance that he was mentally ill, which I think he was. But there was not a feeling that his mental illness should prevent him from being executed. And after his trial and appeal, he was executed in June 1882.
Recently, we were in Buffalo at the Buffalo History Museum talking to Melissa Brown. Let's run a little bit of this, and then you can fill in the blanks.
Sure.
Leon Czolgosz was the assassin that shot President McKinley. He was, I think, around age 25, 26 at the time. He was deemed to be, and certainly this plays out in the newspaper, an anarchist with sympathies towards Emma Goldman. He, had a myriad of issues going on, not least of which were his politics. But when you read the newspaper and kind of the coverage that plays out at the time period, it's very hard to get a true impression of who this man was.
What were the circumstances that Czolgosz shot him?
Well, Czolgosz was an anarchist, and he found Emma Goldman fascinating. Even though Emma Goldman never said to him, and he did meet Emma Goldman, did not say to him to kill anybody. But the fact is, Czolgosz was a person who had this idea because he believed in anarchism that his mission, so it shows he is mentally ill, he wanted to kill the president of the United States, somehow would get away with it, somehow escape, then go to Great Britain and kill the King of England, Edward VII. Escape, and then go to Vatican City and indeed assassinate the Pope. And the whole idea that someone would think he could get away with this is just really unbelievable when you think about it.
How long did McKinley live?
He lasted 8 days. He also had not the best medical attention. X-rays had not been invented yet at the time of Garfield or McKinley. The bullet was not removed in either Garfield or McKinley's case. And the fact is that he suffered for 8 days, but it didn't seem like he was going to die. So Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was up in New York on the Adirondack Mountains hunting because he figured McKinley's going to be fine. And then he had to be found, and it was a certain number of hours went by before they could find him to tell him the president is dead, you are now president. So it was a little panicky for a while. Where is Teddy Roosevelt?
You imply in your book that Teddy Roosevelt would not have been elected president had he not been, had his president, when he was vice president, had been assassinated? You think he wouldn't have made it on his own?
Well, the thing is, he was a replacement vice president because this is sort of like something people don't realize. One of the real forgotten people in history is Garrett Hobart, who was vice president under McKinley in the first term and was very close to McKinley, very close. His wife was close to both the First Lady and McKinley. But he died of heart disease in 1899. There was no provision at that point to replace a vice president, so there was none. And in fact, at that point, if McKinley had been killed before the second term, the succession laws were the Secretary of State would have been next, who was John Hay, who was actually quite famous, John Hay. And the point is that that TR was selected for the second term, and it was just coincidence in 1901, after 6 months, he's president, but it could have been President Hobart if Hobart had not died in office.
So TR goes on to be president, is elected in 1904, and then he chooses not to run in 1908. William Howard Taft is elected, and we have some video this is from something called The Art of Manliness from YouTube. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but it's done a little bit in animation. Let's watch this, and again, you'll tell us the rest of the story.
Sure.
While campaigning for a third term of the presidency in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt exited a hotel in Milwaukee and took a seat in an open-air car. As a crowd gathered around the vehicle, Roosevelt stood up to wave to them. At that moment, John Shrunk, a local saloon keeper, lunged through the well-wishers and shot TR from a distance of less than 7 feet. The bullet entered his right breast, was slowed by a folded copy of a speech he was to make later and his eyeglasses case, and lodged in his chest. As the would-be assassin was subdued, Roosevelt assessed the damage, and when he reached under his shirt to feel the wound, his hand came out bloodied. His aides insisted that Roosevelt go immediately to the hospital, but TR refused their pleas and demanded that he proceed as planned to give a speech to a crowd of 10,000 people who were waiting to hear him speak. Once he arrived, and even though the right half of his body was turning black, Roosevelt mounted the stage unaided, unbuttoned his shirt front to show the audience the spreading blood stain, and declared, "I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose."
Impact of all that on Theodore Roosevelt. I know he didn't win, but what about on his person?
I think it undermines his health, and of course he was a daring kind of a guy. He was always a bit of a character. He decided to go into the Amazon River Basin with his son and others in 1914 and got malaria there and nearly died. It was the Amazon River expedition. And when you think about it, he was always wanting to prove that he was strong and manly since the time he was a kid when he was bullied and had asthma and decided he was going to build up his body and be sports active. And even in his 50s, he was still wanting to do things like an Amazon River expedition. He was a gutsy, courageous guy. And a real, colorful person, just about the most colorful president we've ever had, I think.
The man that shot him, what happened to him?
Schrank was judged mentally ill and put into a mental institution, not executed. It's just different circumstances. I don't know why they did that. And he stayed there until his death in 1943 and had no visitors at all, it is reported. So he was really in isolation. And, but he said at the end of his life, he made the statement that he had tried to kill a, quote, bull moose.
Now, did you say in your book that they didn't take the bullet out of Theodore Roosevelt?
No, the bullet was never taken out.
Why not?
They just, I don't know, they just decided not to. It seems hard to believe because by that time they had x-rays. They knew where it was, but they seemed to feel that it might cause more damage if they removed it than leaving it because it was not apparently affecting him. But I think it probably did undermine his general health. And then he went off to the Amazon River Basin in Brazil. And that, I think, was really a crazy thing to do when you look back on it.
But back in those days, after he finished his speech, did he go right back on the campaign trail after he went to the doctor?
No, he rested up for about 10 days, and the other candidates in the race, Eugene Debs, the socialist, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, and President Taft, suspended their campaigns for those 10 days. But then he went back, yes. The man was amazing, you got to admit. And if I may, I wanted to point out, TR, with something we don't much know, was also, at least in theory, threatened when he was president. In 1903, I uncovered this, and I'm not aware of anybody else knowing it that I know of. Henry Wildbrenner came to his home in Sagamore Hill, Oyster Bay, Long Island, when TR was home, wanted to see him one evening, and the Secret Service was already protecting him, because it was 1903, and 1901 the Secret Service began protection. And he said, I want to see the president, and he was asked, do you have an appointment? No. Well, it's 8 o'clock at night, sorry. No. He leaves. He comes back about an hour later, asks again, sir, we told you, you don't have an appointment, it's too late. He leaves, comes back at 11 o'clock, a third time. Now they're getting suspicious, so they investigate him. They take him to the barn nearby, and they discover he has a firearm on him. So the theory is TR could have been hurt if he had actually agreed to meet this stranger, Henry Wildbrenner, on Long Island, New York, and he went to a mental institution where he stayed the rest of his life in Kings Park, New York.
One of the things I noticed is you're talking about the assassinations and the early presidents. They were tried and convicted and sent to prison, or I don't know how many of them died after
executed.
Yeah.
Well, Booth was killed, of course. Lawrence was put in a mental institution from Jackson's time. Jalgos was executed, and Guteau was executed. And that's
how quickly did they do that back in those? I mean, today it takes forever to get even a trial.
Well, I tell you, in the case of Jalgos, it was very quick. In the case of Guteau, it was like 7 or 8 months after Garfield's death. Of course, if you want to talk about the quickest execution, it's that of the man who tried to kill Franklin D. Roosevelt, Giuseppe Zangara, 5 weeks after he tried to do it, and he had killed Mayor Cermak of Chicago, Anton Cermak. He was executed by the state of Florida, so that was very quick, 5 weeks.
You say in that chapter that 5 people were wounded in Miami. What's the whole story, and who was Zangara?
And Zangara was an Italian immigrant who had come to this country and was struggling and was having trouble making a living. And we now know that he even thought of, maybe didn't take action, of shooting President Hoover because it was the Depression times. But on February 15th, 1933, President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt is in Miami, Florida, at Bayfront Park at a Democratic Party gathering. There's thousands of people there to meet and greet him. And Zangara is in the crowd, and he's a short little guy. He's only about 5 feet tall. He gets up on a chair and aims his weapon at FDR and is knocked by someone. Thank goodness in every case where they're not hurt, it's because somebody knocks their hand. But unfortunately, he mortally wounds Mayor Cermak of Chicago, who's there. And Mayor Cermak is famous for his statement, "Better me than you," to FDR as he's on the way to the hospital. And I think that's very patriotic to say that when you're being shot, that better me than you, but because of Franklin D. Roosevelt, after all, being the president-elect. Now, had he been killed, John Nance Garner, one of my 15 might-have-beens, the vice president-elect, former Speaker of the House, would have been president, and most likely the New Deal would never have occurred.
We have some video of an interview with Giuseppe Zangara back in 1933. It's only 30 seconds. Let's see what he looks like.
Sure.
Don't kill him if he's not president. No. If I was the president, no, you could kill him. You like Mr. Roosevelt as a man? I like him. He was the president. I'm not going to kill him as the president. He's the president.
Would you shoot me?
You're not president.
You won't shoot me?
What will shoot you? You're a working man.
We'll let you go. Would you kill him now?
Yeah, you let me go.
How soon afterwards was he executed?
5 weeks.
Why did it go so fast?
The state of Florida first put him on trial for assault on Mayor Cermak, because Mayor Cermak lasted about 2 weeks. But after his death, they changed it to murder, and they convicted him very quickly, extremely quickly. And the appeal was very quick. It seems almost too quick, and he was executed. So his is the quickest execution, even more than Zhao goes with McKinley. What's
usually, if there is usually, the weapon of choice for these assassins?
Well, it's always a gun, a firearm. Often it's a weapon such as the type that was used in the 19th century. I'm not an expert on the type of guns, so at the moment I can't think of the exact names.
Well, I do remember you had a 38 and a 22,
yes.
And I'm not either an expert on it.
Yeah.
But how often was it a pistol versus a rifle?
It was much more often a pistol, yes.
Huey Long.
Yes, Huey Long, of course, is an especially interesting character. Governor and senator for Louisiana, every man a king. The kingfish, as he was known. And he was controversial, and some people thought he was a fascist because he had stormtroopers, they called it, around him, his own private force. But the fact is, Huey Long also was seen by some as socialistic, although Socialist Party leader Norman Thomas said he was a phony socialist. He really wasn't. Some people thought he had the potential to be an Adolf Hitler type. So he scared a lot of people, but he had a lot of followers. He had a radio show, and he became a real burr in the side of the U.S. Senate. One of those people who a lot of the senators didn't like and didn't get along with, and he kept on attacking Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he declared that he was going to run. He had not actually announced, because people didn't announce that far ahead years ago as they do now, but he was on his way to running for president in 1936 when he is assassinated by a medical doctor, Dr. Carl Austin Weiss, on September 8th, 1935, and dies on September 10th. And by the way, the surgery about him is also very controversial, that the way he was mistreated, they said, as far as surgery and medical care, there's a lot of conspiracy theories about that maybe there were people who just wanted him dead. And the thing is, there were those that say Dr. Weiss did not actually shoot him. They claim he didn't have a gun on him. His son spent his life trying to defend his father. But the point is, we never had a chance to find out, because the guards around Long opened up fire on Weiss and pumped him full of 61 bullets at the time of the assassination in the state capitol in Baton Rouge. And there's still questions about what really happened, whether it could be by accident or not by accident, that maybe his own guards killed him and that Dr. Weiss gets the blame for it. It's still, very controversial to many people.
Dr. Weiss, I think you say, was 25 at the time?
Yes.
And we have some video, this is you're going to see his son, Dr. Weiss's son.
Yes.
And you'll see, this was done by David Mogigliani and also Lucy Krutz, Kreuts, and this was from 2014. It's about a minute, and at the end you'll see Dr. Weiss after he's been shot.
Mm-hmm.
My mother had always been very vague about it. She had told me that my father was killed in an accidental shooting. That somebody approached us, and half the time they're also thinking, "Ha, you're the son of an assassin."
The official version is this. Dr. Weiss walked up to Huey Long, said not a word, and he pulled a pistol and he shot Huey.
all the bodyguards had at least 2 guns, and they emptied every gun and every bullet into Carl Weiss's body.
There are certain things that don't make any sense in this case.
There was not an autopsy of either of the parties.
If there was something to hide, people had plenty of time to coordinate their stories.
There is absolutely no proof that Carl Weiss carried the gun.
Many people wonder why a man would leave home on a Sunday night and walk into a situation that meant certain death.
What was the impact of this?
Well, I think that there was some who thought he might be a threat long to FDR. It certainly removed that threat, and I guess there's some conspiracy theorists who would think FDR may have somehow engineered this, but not seriously, I don't think. But definitely it removed him as a political figure to be concerned about as far as his possible impact on the presidential election in the either in 1936 or 1940.
You then moved to Harry Truman. What's the story about, and how often was he threatened?
Well, I tell you, under him, there were 3 possible people who could have become president. In 1947, according to Margaret Truman, his daughter, hasn't been really authenticated by many other people. It was said the Zionist Stern Gang, one of the terrorist groups trying to create an independent Israel, which had not yet been formed, sent letter bombs, supposedly, to try to kill President Truman. The Stern Gang had been involved in killing British figures in Palestine after World War II. So the argument was that that there was a letter bomb that was sent for Truman, and it was, of course, prevented from getting to him, and was indeed resolved without trouble. But at that point in 1947, depending on the timing, we had the succession law, Presidential Succession Act, changed. The Succession Act, there's been 3 of them. The second one was 1886 to 1947, and the third one is the one that's now in effect. And the second one was that that indeed the Secretary of State would be next in line. There was no vice president because Truman succeeded Franklin Roosevelt. But then the law was changed to make it the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So later in the year 1947, after the law changed, it would have been Republican Speaker of the House Joseph W. Martin Jr. who would have been president. So there's 2 potential might-have-beens there, depending on the timing of if an event had occurred that could have led to the death of President Truman.
We have some video of something we did here at C-SPAN in 2009 outside the Blair House. What were the circumstances? And we'll eventually show where Harry Truman was standing at the window watching these gunmen.
Yes, I guess the more major threat, at least the one much more known about, is in 1950, on November 1st, 1950, when the Trumans were not in the White House. It was being renovated, so they were in Blair House, and we had 2 Puerto Rican nationalists, Graciela Torresola and Oscar Collazo, who wanted to have an independent Puerto Rico. And there'd been a recent, uprising in Puerto Rico a few days earlier, which had been suppressed by the U.S. government, and they were furious because I think they had lost one of their sisters or other relatives. So they decided they were going to kill President Truman, and this caused the most so-called gunplay ever. As far as it went on for about 3 minutes, and a Secret Service agent, Leslie Kofelt, was killed, and a White House police officer was shot and seriously wounded. But Truman was looking from Blair House, looking out the window, and was told by a Secret Service agent somewhere, get inside, get away from the windows. He was watching, sort of like in fascination, at the events occurring right before his eyes.
The video includes a man named Stephen Hunter, who has written a book about this, and you'll see the Blair House is right across the street from the White House. Let's watch.
At this point, here he is, loading his gun. Nobody in the world has seen him yet, except the 2 men, the 3 men he's now shot. The Secret Service and White House police at that end are still consumed with Oscar Collazo, who's shooting at them as they're shooting at them. At that moment, Harry Truman comes to the window. He had been up there, he was in his underwear, he was taking a nap. He heard the shots, and he came to the window. The window was open, we know, and he did look out. So there's a moment, there's this very teetery, scary moment when Gracilio is loading the gun. Gracilio, right, remember, is a very good shot. Harry Truman is right up there.
Any other examples of where Harry Truman was somebody attempted to assassinate him?
Not that I'm aware of, except the one in 1947, which is sort of like, doesn't have a lot of information, mostly marked with Truman, and the 1950 case. That's the two cases.
You can say anything you want to about this. I'm skipping both Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy because we hear so much about it. There's been so many books written, and you deal with it here. But I want to jump to Robert Kennedy's assassination. Mm-hmm. What are the details of that?
Robert Kennedy, of course, is the brother of the former President John F. Kennedy. He had been Attorney General, and he was a senator from New York and sought the presidency in 1968. And the year earlier, we had had the Middle East War, the Six-Day War, and Robert Kennedy had backed Israel against Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. And a year later, on the exact anniversary of the Six-Day War, he's going to be shot and mortally wounded. He'll last about 26 hours, and he'll die on June 6th. But he's actually shot on June 5th, which is the exact opening day of the Six-Day War a year earlier. And his assassin is Sirhan, who's a Palestinian Arab Christian, I wish to point out, not a Muslim though, but he is a Palestinian who had been born in Palestine, had come to the United States and had all kinds of mental issues and problems. But he was a strong believer in the idea of an independent Palestine, and he was resentful of what Israel had done in the war a year earlier, taking over new territories. So indeed, he was working at the Ambassador Hotel, and he was in the kitchen, and the question still arises, why did Robert Kennedy go through the kitchen pantry as he was leaving the rally? And it's still hard to understand why. And there are some who think that there's more than one gunman, but it has not been proved. It's still a very perplexing story to many, however.
You say in your book that Sirhan has applied for parole 14 times over the years, most recently in 2011, but has been denied it and remains in prison after 47 years.
It's true, and he's the only assassin or attempted assassin to have been in prison that long. The two women who tried to kill President Ford were released. Of course, the difference may be they didn't hurt President Ford. Maybe because Robert Kennedy was killed is the difference over the cases where people, where the president is not harmed. I have to believe that's the case.
In 1989, David Frost interviewed Sirhan, and here's a minute of what he sounded like back then.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed an advertisement announcing a parade that was planned to be held that evening in Los Angeles at the Miracle Mile, they called it, and it was to celebrate the Israeli victory of the year before, and it was to be sort of an anniversary parade for the Jewish community in LA, I take it. And that sort of incensed me. And I said, well, I have nothing else to do tonight. I'm going to go down there and see what those people are up to. And I heard that there was a big party at the Ambassador, a few blocks away. And then I decided to go down there and check it out. And that's really what led me to the Ambassador, the big party that was going to be, held down there. And I went down and got myself in trouble.
Did he plead insanity?
Yes, but it did not lead to anything other than putting him in prison. But he also, over time, claims that he didn't remember being there. Different stories at different times in the years since. He's obviously mentally unstable from his earlier life. We know that.
How long was the trial, and how long did it take to put him in prison?
I don't recall exactly, but the trial, it took a few months. But it certainly it did not drag on for a long time.
Another non-president was George Wallace.
Yes. And George Wallace was, of course, shot and paralyzed for life, sadly, on May 15th, 1972 in Laurel, Maryland, at a shopping center there, by Arthur Bremer, who had read up on Lee Harvey Oswald, the John F. Kennedy assassin, had read up on Sirhan, the Robert Kennedy assassin. And, he was someone who wanted to get noticed. And again, there was evidence of mental illness. But yet, the thing that's even more serious than his shooting and paralyzing of Wallace is that he stalked Richard Nixon. And he didn't shoot him, of course, but had he shot and let's say killed Nixon, and this would have been earlier than May 72, this would have been before the Watergate scandal even erupted. It never would have occurred. But Spiro Agnew would have become president. And of course, later we learned of his own illegal activities, which forced him out. So the thought comes to mind, in theory, that he could have been president and then maybe be facing impeachment instead of Richard Nixon. You know,
as I read it right, if I read it right in your book, he was the youngest of all the assassins at age 21.
Yes.
You say in your book that he's been released.
Yes.
2007.
Yes,
Where is he today?
I think, if I'm correct, he has to stay within the state of Maryland, and I think he has to report to a parole officer, I believe. But he didn't kill Wallace. And maybe that's the difference why he finally got released. He shot him, paralyzed him. Wallace lived another 26 years. But yes, he has been released just around the same time that the two women who tried to kill President Ford were released.
Thanks to ABC News, we have a little bit of a background viewing of the assassination attempt right here in the suburbs of Washington.
As always seems to be the case with this kind of tragedy, there was no inkling of trouble. Governor Wallace had encountered heckling earlier in the day as he toured the Maryland suburbs of Washington, but the crowd at Laurel seemed receptive and friendly. Governor Wallace had just finished speaking and had taken off his coat, was shaking hands, when 4 or 5 shots were fired, 2 of them recorded in this film by ABC News cameraman Charlie Jones. Governor Wallace's wife, Cornelia, who was nearby when he was shot, bent over him. Later, she said he seemed to be conscious. The shooting took place so quickly and produced so much confusion that details are still not totally clear. One campaign worker, Jack Ingram, provides a description of the would-be assassin. Ingram said he was trying to shake hands with the governor when a man nearby kept shouting, "Hey, George, hey, George." Ingram said the man stuck a gun right in Governor Wallace's stomach and fired. Doctors say there were 3 major wounds in the leg, arm, and chest.
You have a picture in your book of Ethel Kennedy holding his hand, George Wallace's hand, in the hospital. How unusual is that?
Well, she had experienced the loss of her husband 4 years earlier, and I found that, in the Alabama archives, and I thought, this is an interesting photograph, because it's not just showing that he's recovering, but also that even if there are political differences, party lines are not an issue when it comes to threats to a candidate or to a president. And I think it was very gracious of her and very nice that she did come to see him, and we have that great photograph, yes.
How many other original items like that or even information do you have in the book? Did you find a lot of new things, or
as far as photographs, you mean?
Of anything? In other words, how much new research were you able to find?
Well, I mean, if I can go back to the Lincoln situation, Lincoln had Andrew Johnson as his vice president, was supposed to be killed by one of the other conspirators with John Wilkes Booth, but he wasn't. But if he had been killed, under the succession laws at the time, it would not have been the Secretary of State, who, by the way, was knifed at the time, William Seward, by one of the other people in the conspiracy. It wouldn't have been the Speaker of the House, the more recent law. It would have been the original law of 1792 that said the President pro tempore of the Senate would be next in line, and that was, and I had to really dig hard on this, Senator Lafayette Foster of Connecticut. I picked him up out of the doldrums and made him somewhat famous. And, he was a Connecticut Republican senator. I don't know what kind of a president he would have been, but I do think that Andrew Johnson was a tragic figure, and that I have to believe Lafayette Foster would probably have been better if he had taken over. And then there's also the story that Andrew Johnson was the second-term vice president. Lincoln decided to replace Hannibal Hamlin, his first-term vice president, for political reasons. He wanted a Southerner on the ticket, as Andrew Johnson was. But let's say he had not done that, Hannibal Hamlin would have been president. So he's another one of those sort of like forgettable or not well-known people like Lafayette Foster and like earlier Garrett Hobart under McKinley. These are people that have been able to show would have been president if circumstances had been a little bit different.
February 17, 1974, this is from NBC News. This is a report about Robert Preston flying a Huey helicopter onto the White House lawn during Richard Nixon's term.
The bizarre chase came to an end when the stolen helicopter landed or was forced down on the south lawn of the White House. Maryland State Police say the young pilot had to be forcibly subdued. For the next several hours, the aircraft was thoroughly examined by police, federal officials, and Army mechanics. They determined that despite the buckshot fired by Executive Protection Service, it could be flown away. It had been stolen around midnight from an Army transportation squadron at nearby Fort Meade, Maryland. During the joyride over the suburban countryside, the craft was reportedly flown with considerable skill. The joyriding pilot was identified as 20-year-old PFC Robert Preston, an Army helicopter mechanic who was reportedly unhappy over flunking out of flight school. He was charged with unlawful entry into the White House grounds. His day ended in the psychiatric ward of Walter Reed Army Medical Center.
What happened to him? Did he go to prison eventually?
He was kept in prison for a while, but not long. He was released after I think a year or two.
Was he after Richard Nixon's life? Or was he just wanting to land the helicopter in the South Lawn?
I think he was a little, mentally disturbed, and I think he just wanted attention. I don't think, from what I could gather, that he was really trying to threaten Richard Nixon.
Stephen Sondheim had a Broadway play called The Assassins.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned it in my book. Yeah.
Here is a 50-second clip. And how do you pronounce the man that you say that?
Samuel Byck, B-Y-C-K.
And what did he do?
He never got to do it, but he wanted to hijack a plane. He tried to hijack a plane in the Baltimore-Washington airport. He did not succeed. He ended up killing the pilot, and I think injuring the co-pilot. Then was shot and killed. But he wanted to hijack a plane or have the pilot, take the plane with him in it, and indeed hit the White House. And of course, Richard Nixon wasn't even there at that time, but he wanted to actually attack the White House. So when I first came across this, and it was pretty well hidden, it wasn't talked about much at the time. It got covered more later by History Channel, having an hour about it. And Sean Penn doing a movie, The Assassination of Richard Nixon, which when it first came out, I said, what? I couldn't figure out what that was about, because I didn't really know much about it, back at that time, like 2004. But the point is that had he been able to somehow accomplish that, that would have been September 11th, 27 years before September 11th. That's what's astounding about it.
Here's from The Assassins, Stephen Sondheim's Broadway musical, and it's just 50 seconds.
Hello, Mr. Bernstein? Lenny? How you doing? My name is Sam Byck. We've never met. You're a world-renowned composer and conductor who travels the world over enjoying one success after another. And I'm an out-of-work tire salesman, so I guess that's not surprising. But I hope you'll take a few minutes out of your busy schedule to listen to this tape, which you just opened in the mail. And if you can't listen to it now, maybe you could listen to it tonight. I love that song!
Now, he featured in that Broadway musical 9 different assassination attempts. What happened to this guy?
Well, he was killed by a secret, not a Secret Service member, but by a police officer in the Baltimore airport. He did not succeed. He was killed. So, but he had left a tape behind for Jack Anderson, the columnist, in order to make clear what he intended to do. So he really wanted attention because he had a miserable life economically, and he wanted to blame Richard Nixon for everything that was going wrong. And of course, this was the time of Watergate. So I think it was partly the idea, this guy's got to go, and I'm going to get him to go sooner than, rather than later.
I got the feeling when I read the chapter on Gerald Ford that he may have had the most attempts and the most threats. He was only there for 2.5 years. What are the stories about?
Well, as far as
Gerald
most
Ford?
attempts ever, it would be Lincoln until Barack Obama. As far as that, but Gerald Ford had 2 women, 17 days apart, in the month of September 1975. Indeed, threatened his life, and these were both in California. The first on September 5th, 1975, in Sacramento, California. Lynette Squeaky Frome, a follower of Charles Manson, obviously not quite all there mentally, and used drugs and other things. But she was unhappy because Gerald Ford had not done good things in her mind on the environment, on the, as far as the environment's concerned, and just generally did not like, the kind of stance he was taking. But she had a weapon on her in her dress, but she did not actually withdraw the weapon. So she did not actually directly threaten. She had it on her, but she was not the kind of direct threat that 17 days later, Sarah Jane Moore was on September 22nd, 1975, when we had, indeed, Sarah Jane Moore fire a weapon at Gerald Ford in San Francisco, and a former Marine knocked her hand and saved Ford from any harm. But that also caused a big uproar about who the successor would have been, because Gerald Ford had appointed and had been approved by the House and Senate former Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York to be his vice president. And of course, Rockefeller was for the liberal wing of the Republican Party and had a problem getting confirmed because many Republicans and Southern Democrats didn't want him. And now, twice in 17 days, the thought is, oh my gosh, we have Rockefeller as president, for a moment. And after that, the Reagan wing of the Republican Party was battling for the nomination with Gerald Ford. That's why Ford was in California campaigning those two times in September 75. And what happened is that when Ford finally defeated Reagan by about 100 delegate votes, the Reagan wing made it clear, we will not back you unless you dump Rockefeller and pick Bob Dole, Senator Dole of Kansas. And he did that, and then he lost a close race to Jimmy Carter. And after the fact, 40 years later, said he thought if he had kept Rockefeller, he might have won the election. And I think he might have. It was very close.
Alan Cohen of WCHS News 8 in West Virginia in 1987 interviewed Lynette Squeaky Fromm.
I actually said to myself, are you going to use this gun that's on your leg? This weighty piece that was walking me down there to the Capitol building. And I said, let's just go and see. Ford had his hands out and was waving and had just come from breakfast with the businessmen, and he looked like cardboard to me. But at the same time, I had ejected the bullet in my apartment, and I used the gun as it was.
The chamber was empty, but Secret Service agents found 4 bullets in the clip. Fromm claims she was given the gun for protection, and when Ford came to town, she used it to take a stand on the environment.
I said, he was only 2 blocks away. I said, I got to go and talk to him. And then I thought, that's foolish. He's not going to stop and talk to you. People have already shown you can lay blood in front of them, and they're not, they don't think anything of it.
Where is she today?
They've both been released. I'm not sure where they're living, but they've both been released in 2007, independently of each other. And, we don't hear anything about them. But again, they did not harm the president. They only threatened him.
So you get a pass from the judicial system if you don't actually kill the president?
Well, they were in prison until 2007, and this was like 30 years. But, it does seem to make a difference, because they did not actually harm him. But I think they would think 32 years in prison and they did not kill anyone, in their perspective, would probably be harsh enough.
Here's Gerald Ford talking about the assassination attempt.
Mm-hmm. Approximately halfway between L Street and the state capitol, I noticed a person in the second or third row in a brightly colored dress who appeared to want to either shake hands or speak, or at least wanted to get closer to me. So I hesitated instead of keeping moving as I normally do. And as I stopped, I saw a hand come through the crowd in the first row, and that was the only active gesture that I saw, but in the hand was a weapon.
You also talk about the intruders, and you list them all, a group of people that tried to get into the White House. Were they trying to do harm to the president, or just wanted to get into the White House?
Well, some, I think, wanted to do harm, as we see in some cases. I think there were a couple of cases under Bill Clinton, a couple of cases under Barack Obama, and also under George W. Bush. But I think a lot of them are just looking for attention, or they're just mentally disturbed, and they don't even know why they're there. I think a lot of times they are confused. But there are definite threats that have occurred. And of course, the one that's most startling is under Barack Obama last year on September 19th, when Omar Gonzalez was able to get over the fence and actually get into the White House. Nobody else has ever been able to do that. And that's led to more improvements on fencing, and of course, the need to change the Secret Service and bring it more up to par, because these kind of things are very scary, as it is for presidential candidates as well.
I didn't remember this, but you say in your book, you're talking about the man, Gerald Gaines, was a D.C. resident who climbed the fence surrounding the White House. This is again during Gerald R. Ford, twice in 11 days in 1975, and apparently again in 1976. Did it make the kind of publicity that the recent...
No, I had trouble finding it. I had to really dig deep.
Why do you think they didn't publicize it back then?
The Secret Service doesn't like to tell us more than they have to. If it's something that's very public, they have to, obviously. But they don't, I think, want us to know every case. And I think I understand why, because that could make things much more, people could be much more concerned about the safety of the president. So I think the thought of always reporting everything to the news media, if it can be avoided, I think they try to avoid it. And I generally agree with that.
You also point out that in the first instance, he was on the grounds unimpeded for an hour and a half, actually approached presidential daughter Susan Ford.
Susan Ford, yes.
And you say that wasn't easy to find.
No, it was not easy to find, no. A lot of things are not reported in the news media. They're hushed up.
Now, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who fired at, there was no bullet in the chamber, fired at Gerald Ford.
Well, actually didn't fire. She had it on her, but it was Sarah Jane Moore that fired.
Sarah Jane Moore fired. But the reason, are they the only two women that you found over the years?
The only other case would be Mary Surratt, who had the boarding house, where, of course, where Booth and the conspirators, including her own son, met. So, yes, she was the first woman hanged by the U.S. government, executed by the U.S. government. She was not directly involved in the events of that day, but she was involved in the conspiracy. Although some people have said she was a victim and should not have been executed. Just like Dr. Samuel Mudd is another story. Still not clear. Did he actually know Booth or did he not? There's been different stories at different times, different viewpoints. There's still confusion about it.
One more on Gerald Ford, because we get to hear Sarah Jane Moore talk about what her mission was from an ABC News documentary. This is about 50 seconds.
Sarah Jane Moore's motives were confused. Her purpose was not.
I knew that that's the only shot I would have was a headshot. He came out, looked right at me, and after I fired the shot, he stopped. Cold, and I did have time for a second shot, had never planned for a second shot, had practiced and was psyched for one shot.
One shot might have done it if it hadn't been for a man who almost wasn't there. Vietnam veteran Oliver Semple just happened to be downtown.
I said, well, the guy's from Michigan. I've never seen him in person. I'll stick around to see him, if I can see what he looks like. Everybody started pushing everybody. For some strange reason, I looked down, and I had seen Sarah Jane Moore go in her purse and pull a revolver. I yelled, "The bitch has got a gun."
Out of prison now.
Yes, in 2007, both of them. It's been amazing, yes. But Sirhan is still in prison.
So this book for you took how long?
Well, I've been thinking about it over years of doing lectures, but it's 2 years ago that I was asked to write this book, offered it by Roman Littlefield, and I agreed to do it. So it took a little bit more than a year, and I went through several drafts and had a number of people help me that I mentioned, that were very helpful. And then all the other stages to the point where it finally got published in August. So it's basically 2 years.
And where do you teach?
I teach at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida, in the history department.
And so if I was in your class, what would I be learning about?
Well, I've taught courses on the U.S. in the 1960s, going on to 1974, actually, not just the 60s. So basically from Kennedy to Nixon, through Nixon. The New Deal, because I published another book earlier on the New Deal period, so I like to teach that. Also, the U.S. since 1945, the U.S. 1900 and 1945. I've also done diplomatic history, which I am very much interested in, and also the American Presidency, and we'll be teaching a class in the spring on the American Presidency.
Where are you from originally?
Originally from New York, from Queens County, born in Jamaica, Queens. I like to joke that I was born in the same hospital as Donald Trump, just a year and a half difference in age, and then lived in Nassau County, and then moved to South Florida in 1989.
And where did you get your education?
I went to Queens College of the City University of New York, undergraduate and master's, and then the City University of New York Graduate School, and my dissertation advisor, who also helped me to get it published, was Arthur Schlesinger Jr.
What do you remember from him?
Fascinating man, and you know, I was very proud to have taken courses with him, and that he sponsored me for my dissertation. And then I had to cut it down, of course, for Johns Hopkins University Press, but I got it published in 1981 under the title "Twilight of Progressivism: The Western Republican Senators and the New Deal."
So when you go out and make speeches about the assassination attempts and the threats, what's your audience want to know the most about?
They're always most interested in the John F. Kennedy conspiracy theories, I'd say the most, and also Lincoln. They always focus on those two. They don't seem to care as much or know as much about, let's say, McKinley and Garfield. And I think that's sad because, again, I think Garfield is a real tragedy, and even McKinley is, but somehow it's John F. Kennedy, maybe Robert Kennedy a bit also, and Abraham Lincoln that draw the most attention.
We haven't talked, and we're about running out of time, we haven't talked about four presidents: Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. What would you like to say about those? And there's obviously more in your book.
Yes, well, John Hinckley, of course, was the person who shot President Reagan, and President Reagan was not wearing a bulletproof vest that day. It was a short trip from the White House. The Secret Service agent wasn't either, and they were both wounded. If he had worn it, he would not have had the serious wound that he could have died from. But the thing is, John Hinckley was stalking Jimmy Carter before this. During the fall of 1980, so that if he had killed Carter, Walter Mondale it was one of the 50 it might have been, would have become president. And maybe, it's hard to know, maybe if Mondale would come in with the sympathy of the death of Carter, maybe Ronald Reagan wouldn't have won in 1980. So who knows? That's certainly possible. I don't think there's any question. And Barack Obama in 2008 had two conspiracies against him by young people, young men in Denver, Colorado. The plan was to try to kill him at the convention as he accepted the nomination for president. So when I hear that, I think of the Manchurian Candidate syndrome idea of that kind of a scene from the film. And also in Tennessee, and there's been constant death threats against him. And of course, the Omar Gonzalez thing wasn't really directly against him. He wasn't in the building, but there's been so many death threats, more than anybody has had since Abraham Lincoln.
And the Omar Gonzalez thing was what?
He is the man who leaped over the fence and got into the White House a year ago, and is the only person to got into the White House, and that's certainly alarming. But that indicates the security broke down, and apparently one of the Secret Service agents inside the building was asleep.
If you had had more time and a bigger book, what would you have devoted it to?
More time. You mean a different topic, you mean?
No, on this topic. I mean, is there a lot that you could have talked about?
Well, I have thought that an interesting idea would be, and I don't know if I'll do it, possibly write a book on the 15 might-have-beens beyond a chapter. Maybe look into the background of these 15 men, which includes some people we know very well, like Joe Biden, Dick Cheney, Walter Mondale, Al Gore, Spiro Agnew, but also includes, at the same time, Lafayette Foster, Garrett Hobart, and also Hannibal Hamlin, and also Joseph W. Martin Jr., and others. So I think, it would be interesting to go further into that. And it's a possible thought. I'm not sure what I'll do, but I think there's enough information I could do a good job on that in the future.
What's the question that everybody asks you when you're interviewed?
The question that everybody asks me when I'm interviewed? Well, maybe more as a joke, why do you like such a morbid subject? And the answer is, it's fascinating.
On that note, Ronald L. Feinman, the author of Assassins, Threats, and the American Presidency. We're out of time, and we thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.